Her name was Miriam May Whitlow, and the first thing people noticed about her wasn't her soft blue eyes or the way she always looked like she was holding her breath. It was her body, broad-shouldered, thick-hipped, full in the middle like bread just out of the oven. Back in the Pennsylvania mill town she came from, folks called her a big girl in that tone that made it sound like a warning. Men didn't look twice, and women whispered that maybe it was a blessing she never married. But Miriam still hoped. Not loudly, not the way other girls dreamed aloud. Her hope lived quiet in her chest like a bird that didn't know it was locked in a cage. By 31, Miriam had buried both her parents, worked 10 years stitching uniforms in a sweatshop, and finally gave up waiting for some kind-hearted man to see past her size. Instead, she answered an ad from a rancher out west looking for a wife. Honest woman wanted, not afraid of work. Age and past unimportant. Must be ready to settle down. He'd signed it. Elijah Gray, Dry Creek, Wyoming territory. No picture. Just a few lines of rough handwriting and a promise of land, safety, and partnership. Miriam had nothing to lose. The train ride west took nearly 2 weeks. Miriam wore her best dress, the dark blue one with the mended hem, and kept her hands in her lap the whole time. The other women in the car, young brides headed to places they couldn't even pronounce, talked about love like it was guaranteed. Miriam didn't talk much. She thought maybe this wasn't about love. Maybe it was just about being chosen, finally. Dry Creek was not what she expected. The town was smaller than she'd imagined, just a stretch of buildings squatting in the dust like they were hiding from the wind. Elijah was not waiting at the depot. A boy from the general store said he'd gone up to the ridge for the week, working cattle. Miriam waited. Days passed. No word. She rented a room above the saloon, where the walls were so thin she could hear men laughing long into the night. She wrapped herself tight in her shawl and tried not to cry. On the 5th day, a woman named Doreen knocked on her door. She ran the saloon and didn't have time for nonsense. Said Miriam might as well be useful if she was going to hang around. So Miriam helped in the kitchen. She scrubbed pots, peeled potatoes, and learned not to flinch when men made remarks under their breath. On the 7th day, Elijah showed up. He was younger than she'd imagined, maybe 35, broad in the chest, quiet in the eyes. Wore a hat low and kept his voice lower. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her like she was a puzzle with pieces he'd never seen before. "You Miriam?" he asked. She nodded, suddenly aware of the flower on her skirt and the sweat at her neck. "You're bigger than I thought." That was the first thing he said. Miriam didn't answer. She'd learned long ago that words didn't fix everything. He scratched his chin. "Suppose I should have written more clear. Guess I imagined someone smaller, lighter." She looked at him, then really looked, and something in her hardened. "Guess I imagined someone waiting at the station," she said. That shut him up. Still, he took her back with him. His ranch sat on the edge of a canyon, where the sky seemed too big and the land too empty. The house was one room with a loft, half built like the man who owned it. He didn't talk much, just handed her a pail for water and pointed out where the stove leaked smoke. No kiss, no warm words, just silence and work. Weeks passed. Miriam cooked, cleaned, and mended. She learned the rhythm of the ranch, how the wind came from the north in the mornings and the coyotes cried at dusk. Elijah was never cruel, but he wasn't kind either. He didn't touch her unless it was by accident. He didn't sleep beside her. When she asked why, he said he wasn't ready, said he had his reasons. Miriam started to feel like furniture, like she'd been picked for her usefulness, not for her heart. One night, she found a letter in the drawer of his desk. It wasn't hers to read, but something in her had started to curl up, and she needed answers. The handwriting was delicate, not Elijah's. The letter was from a woman named Ruth. She wrote about love like it had ruined her. Wrote about a baby, about shame, about a man who left without saying goodbye. Miriam read every line twice. Then she folded the letter and put it back. That night, she didn't sleep. She started watching him more closely. The way his hands shook sometimes when he thought no one saw. How he looked at the ridge like it held something sacred or buried. She didn't know who Ruth was or what Elijah had done, but something was off, not just with him, with the whole place. The ranch hand spoke in half-truths. The storekeeper stopped talking when she walked in. Even Doreen, who had a sharp tongue and sharper eyes, warned her once to keep her head on straight. Miriam didn't know what that meant, but it stuck. One afternoon, a stranger came riding up to the ranch. His coat was too fine for this part of the world, and his smile was the kind that made Miriam uneasy. He said his name was Mr. Tisdale, and he wanted to speak to Elijah about a mutual debt. Elijah didn't invite him in. They talked outside, low and tense. When the man left, Elijah's hands were clenched into fists, and his face was a mask. That night, Elijah drank. First time Miriam had seen him do it. He sat by the fire, staring into it like he was trying to burn something away. He told her about his brother, about how he'd taken money from the wrong people, ran off, and left Elijah to pay the price. Said Tisdale was one of them. Said it wasn't over. Miriam didn't know whether to believe him, but she stayed quiet. She learned long ago that not every truth came all at once. Then, one morning, she found blood on the porch. Just a few drops, but enough to make her stomach twist. Elijah claimed it was nothing, just a cut from barbed wire. But later, she found a knife hidden beneath the floorboard. The blade was clean, but the handle was sticky. That night, she dreamed of Ruth's letter, of the baby no one ever mentioned again. Miriam didn't ask Elijah about it. She just watched, listened, and waited. Something was wrong. Something had happened long before she got here. And whatever it was, she wasn't sure she could survive it. But one thing she knew for certain, this wasn't the life she was promised. This wasn't love. And whatever secret this ranch held, she wasn't going to ignore it. Not anymore. Elijah wasn't the only one with shadows trailing behind him. On the edge of the gray ranch lived a man named Roy Thatcher, Elijah's nearest neighbor, if you could call someone who lived 5 miles out a neighbor. Roy came around now and then, mostly with cattle concerns or offers to trade supplies. He was built like an old oak, tall, rough, always with dirt under his fingernails and a half-smile that never quite reached his eyes. He talked more than Elijah, which wasn't saying much, and had a way of saying things that made Miriam uneasy, like he was always testing the air for secrets. Roy's eyes lingered too long, and his questions cut too close to places Miriam didn't know were still tender. Once, he asked her how long she planned on staying. She answered, "I'm married, aren't I?" And his smile stretched just a little too wide. "That's not what I asked," he said. She didn't answer after that. Then there was Doreen, still sharp as ever at the saloon, but something had changed in the way she looked at Miriam since she moved out to the ranch. There was a warning in her glances now. Doreen had once been something close to a friend in the lonely in-between days, but now she looked at Miriam like she was walking toward a fire she couldn't see. "Be careful," Doreen said one afternoon when Miriam came to trade eggs. Not all men want a wife for the same reason. When Miriam asked what she meant, Doreen just shook her head. Some want to help her, some want a witness, and some, they just want someone who won't ask too many questions. But it was the young ranch hand, Jesse, who stirred up the most unease in Miriam. He couldn't have been more than 20, with freckles under sunburned skin and eyes that darted around like he was afraid of being seen. He didn't speak much, and when he did, it was quick, nervous things, always watching Elijah before he answered anything. One morning, Miriam found him near the barn with a gash on his arm, trying to bind it with a dirty rag. She offered to help, and he flinched so hard he nearly dropped the knife in his belt. When she asked what happened, he just said, "It was an accident. I shouldn't have said anything." Then he went silent. That night, Elijah was especially quiet at supper. He watched Miriam more than usual, and his hand trembled when he reached for his coffee. She noticed, but didn't speak of it. More strange things began to stack up, like kindling waiting for a spark. Miriam would find tools buried under feed sacks, like someone didn't want them found. The barn door, which always creaked like a scream, suddenly went silent after someone oiled the hinges. But Elijah swore he hadn't touched it. And then there were the voices, soft, low murmurs outside the cabin when Miriam lay awake at night, too afraid to move toward the window. One day, Roy came by with a wild turkey slung over his horse. He handed it to Elijah like it was a gift, but the air between them was heavy. "Still got your girl?" Roy asked. "She's settling fine?" Elijah's jaw clenched. "She's not a girl," he said. "She's my wife." Roy smiled again, that same knowing smile. "Right, wife. Guess everyone finds their kind of quiet." When he left, Miriam asked Elijah what he meant. Elijah didn't answer, but he stood by the window for a long time, staring at the trail Roy had taken. Finally, he muttered, "Roy's got a past. Some men talk too much to hide what they've done." Miriam didn't press. Elijah's words always carried weight, but never clarity. And then there was the letter. Miriam had been sweeping when it slipped from Elijah's coat pocket, folded into quarters so tight the paper had deep lines like scars. She hesitated before picking it up, but something told her she needed to know. It was unsigned. The words were shaky, desperate. "You promised me she wouldn't know. You said you'd handle it. If she talks, it's not just your neck on the line. No name, no return address. Just those words and the knowledge that someone was watching her. Watching this house." She gave the letter back without saying she'd read it. Slid it onto the table when Elijah wasn't looking and waited to see if he'd say anything. He didn't. He just picked it up, folded it once more, and burned it in the stove. Miriam's stomach turned. She no longer felt like a stranger just in a marriage. She felt like a stranger in her own life, in someone else's story. A week later, Jesse disappeared. Elijah said he left in the night. Said he had family up north. Needed to go. Miriam didn't believe it. Jesse hadn't taken any of his things. His bedroll was still in the loft. His boots were still muddy by the door. She didn't say anything at first, but when she brought it up 2 days later, Elijah's face turned cold. "What are you trying to say?" he asked. Miriam just looked at him and said, "I think you're hiding something." He didn't respond. He just walked outside and didn't come back until the moon was high. That was when Miriam began to understand. Everyone had secrets here. Roy, with his 2 wide smiles and loaded questions. Doreen, who had once whispered that Elijah wasn't always so quiet. That years ago, there had been trouble, something to do with land and a woman who vanished. Jesse, scared enough to flinch from a touch. And Elijah, who burned letters, buried knives, and watched the ridge like he was afraid of what might come walking down from it. But Miriam had secrets, too. She hadn't told Elijah everything either. About the child she lost when she was 19, the one buried in a grave without a name because her father said shame didn't get tombstones. She hadn't told him about the man who left her after that, or the loneliness that had nearly killed her before she ever boarded the train west. She thought she could start over, that people were simpler out here, but there was nothing simple about Dry Creek. Miriam started writing her own letters, not to send, just to feel her thoughts take shape. She wrote them at night and folded them into the lining of her sewing bag. Little pieces of herself no one else could touch. In one of them, she wrote, "I think I was brought here for a reason, but it's not the one I hoped for. And I'm afraid I'm part of something I don't understand. But I'm watching. I see more than they think." Because now Miriam wasn't just a mail-order bride. She was a woman waking up inside a lie, surrounded by people who weren't who they said they were. And as the wind howled across the canyon at night and the coyotes screamed in the dark, she began to wonder just how deep the lies went and what it would cost her to find out. The wind had changed. It blew harder across the ridge, colder too, even though the calendar said spring. Miriam felt it in her bones. Something was coming, something already shifting. The air around the house had a weight to it now, as if it carried secrets no longer content to stay buried. She could barely sleep, half listening through the walls at night for the sound of boots outside, or Elijah's soft footfalls pacing the floor downstairs. He didn't know she noticed, but she had. Every night for the past week, he'd crept from their bedroll and gone outside, sometimes for an hour, sometimes until dawn. One night, She followed him, wrapped in her shawl, feet bare on cold boards. She waited until the door eased shut behind him, then slipped through the brush until she saw the lantern light swaying ahead. Elijah walked to the edge of the ravine near the cattle pens, then past it, out into a rocky clearing no one ever used. Miriam stayed behind a mesquite bush, heart pounding. He wasn't alone. A man stood with him. Not Roy. Taller. Paler. He wore a long coat and moved like a man used to giving orders. She couldn't hear the words, but Elijah's posture said enough. Head down, shoulders tense. The man handed him something, a parcel wrapped in oilcloth. Miriam's breath caught. The man turned. His face was ghost white in the moonlight. The stranger from weeks ago, Mr. Tisdale. Elijah didn't tell her the man came back. He returned to the house, close to dawn, smelling of sweat and smoke. Miriam pretended to sleep. When he finally lay beside her, his fingers brushed her arm as if seeking comfort. She didn't move. Her mind was already far away. That morning, she found the parcel hidden under the floorboards near the stove. She waited until Elijah went to the north pasture. Inside were papers, old deeds, one with Roy Thatcher's name scrawled on it, maps, and a photograph. A young woman holding a child, face blurred with time. Miriam stared at the picture, her gut twisting. Ruth? She couldn't know for sure, but the way the woman looked at the child, clinging, fearful, it told her everything. The woman wasn't smiling. She looked like she was trying to protect that child from the person behind the camera. Later that day, Doreen showed up. Miriam hadn't sent for her. The older woman just walked into the yard like she'd done it 100 times. She didn't smile. We need to talk, she said. They sat inside, fire snapping in the hearth. Doreen didn't dance around it. I knew Ruth. She worked at the saloon years ago. Quiet girl, big eyes. She got caught up with Elijah's brother, Caleb. She paused. He was trouble. Got her pregnant. Promised to marry her. Never did. Miriam said nothing. Her fingers tightened on the teacup in her lap. He left town, Doreen continued. But not before someone saw him beating her behind the stables. When she disappeared, folks figured she ran off. Elijah said she'd gone east. But Ruth never wrote, never sent for her things. And then one day, Elijah came into town with a new horse. Expensive saddle, new boots. Said he sold cattle. But everyone knew cattle hadn't moved that month. What are you saying? Miriam's voice was low, hollow. I don't know what Elijah did, Doreen said. But he lied. About Ruth. About Caleb. And I think the man you married ain't just quiet. I think he's hiding something deep. And if he's anything like his brother, he'll do what it takes to keep it hidden. The world shifted under Miriam's feet. She thought back to the bruises she'd seen on Jesse's arm. The way Elijah never spoke about his family. The way he burned that letter without reading it. All the missing pieces suddenly seemed sharper now. And worse, they started to fit. That night, Miriam confronted him. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She sat at the table with the photograph in front of her, waiting. When Elijah walked in, she said, "Tell me who she is." He stopped in his tracks. His face drained of color. "Where did you find that?" he asked. "Under the floorboards, along with the deeds. The ones with Roy's name. The ones I think you weren't supposed to have." He didn't sit, just hovered there like a man facing down a storm he'd hoped would never reach him. "Ruth was Caleb's girl," he said at last. "She got in trouble. He didn't want the baby. He left. I tried to help. I gave her money. I swore I'd take care of things. What happened to her?" Elijah looked at the wall. His voice went soft. "She died. It wasn't murder. She was sick. Fever took her, out near the old mining shack. She was hiding there. You buried her." He nodded, barely. "And the child?" "She wasn't there when I went back. I think Roy took her." Miriam's heart seized. "Roy." They had a fight before she ran off. He used to come by at night, said he loved her. I told him to stay away. But I think he followed her. I don't know what he did with the girl, but I know he's got leverage over me now. That's what the land's about. He's got claims all around my fence line. Keeps squeezing me for more. And Tisdale, Elijah's eyes darkened. He's with the old mining company. They've been trying to buy us both out for years. Roy made a deal. I didn't. They're forcing me to sell, or else they tell everyone what they think happened to Ruth. What they can't prove, they'll invent. So you took a wife? Miriam whispered. To what? Look respectable. His jaw clenched. No, I didn't marry you to cover anything. I married you because I wanted to stop running. I thought maybe you'd be different. Not because of how you look, because you didn't talk like you were trying to fix anyone. I thought I could be better around you. Miriam stared at him. Her voice barely carried across the table. But you didn't tell me the truth. I didn't think you'd stay if you knew. He was right. That night, she packed a bag. But she didn't leave. Instead, she rode into town and found Roy Thatcher sitting on the porch of the feed store, sharpening a knife. Where's the girl? She asked. Roy grinned. What girl? The one Elijah said you took. Ruth's daughter. He stood slow and tall. That's a long time ago, Mrs. Gray. Miriam didn't flinch. You're threatening him, using her as leverage. Roy leaned close, breath sour. Maybe I am. Or maybe your husband isn't telling you everything. You ever think about that? Maybe he didn't bury Ruth alone. Maybe she wasn't dead when he left her. Miriam went cold. I could go to the sheriff, she said. And tell him what? That your husband buried a dead girl 20 miles from here a decade ago? No body, no proof. Just gossip from a saloon woman who drinks too much and a mail-order wife who got in over her head. His voice was poison, calm and cruel. You got one move left, Mrs. Gray. Leave this place. Go back east. You weren't meant for this kind of story. But Miriam didn't leave. She went to Doreen, told her everything. And Doreen, bless her bitter soul, said she had one more card to play. 3 days later, a man rode into town with a scar down one cheek and a girl riding side saddle behind him. Doreen had sent for him, an old Pinkerton agent she used to know. He'd been hunting men like Tisdale for years. The girl was maybe 10, big brown eyes, half Comanche maybe, silent as stone. Her name was Lucy. She was Ruth's daughter. She'd been raised by a ranch widow 3 counties over, paid monthly by Roy to keep quiet. Doreen's contact had tracked it all down. Roy's fake land deeds, Tisdale's crooked contracts, the ledger that proved Roy had been siphoning cattle from both ranches to finance his hold on Elijah. With Lucy back, Roy's story fell apart. But that didn't make Elijah innocent. The law came, slow but certain. They found Ruth's grave. They found the shack. They questioned Elijah for hours. He told the truth, mostly, but some things couldn't be proven. He didn't go to jail, but he lost most of his land in the deal that followed. Roy was arrested, charged with fraud, bribery, and interference with land patents. Elijah came back to a house that felt smaller, quieter, and Miriam, still there but different. They didn't speak much for days. One evening, he asked, "Why'd you stay?" She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "Because I wanted the truth. And because someone had to help Lucy remember who her mother was." Elijah looked at the fire, and Miriam looked at him. They weren't in love. Not yet. Maybe never. But they had something harder to name, something that came from walking through fire and still choosing not to run. And in that silence, in that slow rebuilding of broken things, Miriam began to believe in something else too. That maybe being chosen wasn't about being the prettiest or the thinnest or the easiest. Maybe it was about being the one who stayed. The storm didn't come from the sky. It started inside the house, like a slow-burning fuse no one had the nerve to snuff out. After Lucy arrived, everything shifted. Her presence was a spark to dry kindling. She didn't speak much. Barely a whisper came from her lips, but her silence echoed louder than words. The weight of her past and the truth she carried with her settled over the ranch like a shroud. Elijah avoided her eyes. Miriam tried to reach out, but Lucy flinched whenever anyone got too close. It was Doreen who found a way in. She started brushing the girl's hair in the evenings, humming old ballads, and letting Lucy sit near the fire, never pushing, never asking. And slowly, Lucy began to respond. But the ranch wasn't safe anymore. Word spread that Roy Thatcher had been arrested. And with him, the men he'd paid off started to disappear. Some skipped town. Others turned on each other. And one, an old ranch hand named Griggs, rode up to the fence line with a rifle and a warning. "You're next, Gray." Elijah stood in the doorway that night, rifle across his lap. Miriam sat near the hearth, holding Lucy close, her hands shaking. "They won't come tonight," he said, trying to sound certain. "They just want to scare us." Miriam looked up. "They already have." In the days that followed, Elijah tried to set things right. He sold off a stretch of land to cover legal costs, pulled every favor he had left to keep Lucy safe. But nothing worked. The sheriff's office was thin and miles away, and no one in town wanted to get between old enemies. The law had taken Roy, but it hadn't taken his reach. Someone was still moving cattle from the north pasture. Someone was still cutting fence lines. And then someone burned the barn. It happened just after sundown. Miriam had gone to check on the hens. She saw the flicker first, then heard the roar of fire and the frantic cries of horses. Elijah and Doreen ran from the house, water buckets in hand. Miriam grabbed Lucy and ran, her lungs burning with smoke. The flames reached high into the sky, eating the barn like it had been soaked in oil. The horses barely made it out. The tack and feed were gone. The damage was total. Elijah didn't speak for hours after. He sat alone in the yard, ash on his skin, eyes blank. Miriam approached him just before dawn. "You know who did this?" He nodded slowly. "Tisdale, or one of his men. You said he only wanted the land." Elijah looked at her then, eyes tired and full of something far worse than fear, regret. "It's not just land. It's the mine." She stared at him. "The old mine? That's been dead for years." "It hasn't," he said. "That's the lie. Tisdale found silver veins running under both properties, mine and Roy's. He's been drilling for months, quietly, under old claims no one thought to contest." "You knew," Miriam whispered. "I suspected. I went out there last winter. Saw the tailings. He's already sold shares to men in Denver. If I don't sell, if I talk, he loses everything. And if you stay silent, you become part of it." He didn't answer. The next morning, Miriam found Doreen in the kitchen, already packing. "I'm taking Lucy," the older woman said, not looking up. "Elijah means well, but this place is cursed. That man's got blood on his hands, and I'm not waiting to see who spills more." "You can't just run," Miriam said. "I'm not running. I'm surviving." Doreen closed the case. "You should think about doing the same." But Miriam stayed, not because she trusted Elijah and not because she wasn't afraid. She stayed because the truth had started something inside her, a fire of its own. This wasn't just about land, or lies, or even Ruth. It was about who got to decide the worth of a woman, a child, a life. And Miriam had spent too long being told she was too much of one thing and not enough of another. That night, she made her own decision. She rode to the mine. It was nearly 3 miles out, past the dry creek bed and into the hills. The road was rough, but the moon was full. She found a site surrounded by wire and guarded by 2 men with lanterns. She didn't bother sneaking. She walked straight up, hands raised, and said, "Tell Mr. Tisdale Miriam Gray wants a word." They brought her in. He stood near a drill, hands black with grease. He smiled like a banker, polite, cold, and calculating. "I wonder when you'd come," he said. "You burned my barn." He laughed softly. "I didn't, but I understand why you think I did. You threatened my husband, my home. You're trying to erase what happened to Ruth. That won't stay buried." Tisdale tilted his head. "Mrs. Gray, I understand you're upset, but this isn't personal. It's business. The land's worth something now. That's the only difference between then and now. And your husband? He's a liability. Always has been." Miriam looked him dead in the eye. "So am I." When she returned home, Elijah was pacing. "Where were you?" he shouted. "Making a choice," she said. "I talked to Tisdale." "You what?" "I told him he won't sell, and that if anything happens to Lucy or to you, I'll ride to Denver myself and tell every investor what he's done." Elijah stared at her, like she'd gone mad. You don't know what he's capable of. I know what I am, Miriam said, and I'm done being quiet. The next day, everything broke. Doreen never left. Lucy refused to go, clinging to Miriam like a root to dry earth. At dusk, Griggs returned, this time with 2 men and a demand. Elijah's signs over the land, or they torched the house. Miriam didn't wait. She came out holding her rifle, standing beside Elijah. You want it, you'll have to shoot me first. Griggs didn't move. Neither did Miriam. Then Lucy stepped out behind them. She didn't say a word. She just stood there, small and thin, holding Ruth's old shawl in her hands. Something in that moment shifted. The standoff cracked under its own weight. One of the men turned and walked away. The other lowered his weapon. Griggs cursed and spat, but he didn't fire. He left with fire in his eyes, but no bullets. The sheriff came 2 days later, sent by the Pinkerton agent. Tisdale was arrested on charges of land fraud and conspiracy. Griggs was picked up trying to flee west. But none of that undid the harm already done. The ranch was half ruined. The land scarred. The house, damaged in the barn fire, would take months to repair. And Elijah, though he stayed, looked like a man half buried. He barely spoke. Miriam watched him disappear inside himself, day after day. One evening, she found him on the porch. She sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly. I can't fix what I've done, he said. No, Miriam replied. You can't, but I can tell the truth. I can let go of what I tried to hide. She looked at him, tired and worn, but still standing. Then do that, but don't expect forgiveness like it's a right. You have to earn it. From me, from Lucy, from yourself. Elijah nodded. That night, he took Lucy's hand and told her everything. How Ruth came to him scared. How she begged for help. How he tried and failed. How he buried her, swore he'd keep the child safe, but never had the courage to face the truth. How he let Roy hold the reins of guilt and did nothing to stop it. Lucy didn't cry. She just sat there, and when he was done, she stood and walked away. But she didn't slam the door. She didn't run. Miriam sat with him long after, watching the moon rise over broken land. They weren't whole, but they weren't lying anymore. And in that strange silence, where every secret had been dragged into the light, Miriam felt something like hope. Fragile, thin as thread, but real. Because sometimes the end of everything is what makes something new possible. The first real rain in weeks came with thunder. It pounded the land like a reckoning, soaking the dry hills and filling the cracks in the earth that had split beneath months of tension. Miriam stood at the edge of the porch, watching the water stream from the roof like tears the land had been holding back. Behind her, the house was quiet. Lucy was asleep. Doreen rested in the kitchen, knitting in silence. Elijah paced the floor like a man bracing for a noose. Everything had unraveled, and now it was time to face what was left. Word of Tisdale's arrest had sent tremors through the county. He wasn't just another greedy man caught with his hands in someone else's soil. He was connected, deeply, to Denver money, to land speculators, to men who didn't like being embarrassed. And worse, Tisdale was already talking bargaining. If Miriam had thought taking him down would end things, she was wrong. She saw it in the letter the Pinkerton man delivered 2 days earlier. There's still loose ends. Griggs is gone, but not alone. That was all it said, and she knew exactly what it meant. Roy Thatcher. She hadn't seen him since his arrest. Elijah had believed the man would rot in a cell. But Miriam had grown up hearing how justice bent for certain men, how influence could sweep away almost anything. And sure enough, it came. The rumor that Roy had struck a deal, testimony for freedom, that he'd walk, that he was already on his way back. Elijah, she said softly as he stared out the window, he's coming. He nodded. I know. You gonna let him? I don't know what I'll do, he said, but I know what I should have done a long time ago. That night, Miriam stayed awake, seated near the hearth with Lucy curled against her. Doreen had taken to sleeping in the chair by the front door, rifle across her lap. They were all waiting for something they couldn't name. He came 2 days later. No warning, no sound of hooves, Just a knock on the door, 3 slow raps like someone announcing death. Elijah opened it. Roy Thatcher stood there like nothing had happened. Clean shaven, hat in hand, like a man come to borrow sugar. "Elijah," he said calmly, "we need to talk." Miriam rose slowly, placing herself between Lucy and the man who had once tried to erase her. "There's nothing left to talk about," Elijah said. But Roy didn't leave. He stepped inside like he still owned the air between them. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," he said. "I'm here to fix this, like we should have done back then." Miriam couldn't believe it. The gall of him, the casual tone, like they hadn't buried a girl. Like Lucy wasn't flesh and blood, standing in the room, watching this man try to rewrite the past. "You mean bury it again?" Miriam asked. He turned to her with that same patronizing smile. "I mean, do what's best for everyone. That girl's not your burden. She's a problem, and problems need solutions." Doreen stood then, rifle raised. "Get out of this house before I show you mine." Roy didn't flinch. "You think you'll win this war? I already walked out of trial with clean hands. You really think a court's going to believe some fat mail-order bride and a half-crazy girl?" Miriam didn't feel the rage, only the cold clarity of it. She stepped forward. "No, but they'll believe your ledger." Roy froze. "What?" "I found it," she said, "behind a false wall in the tax shed. All the names, all the payments, the bribes. You never could resist keeping score, could you?" His eyes narrowed. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" She handed Elijah a stack of folded pages, yellowed with dust and rot. "The ledger." Roy lunged. He wasn't going for the book. He was going for Lucy. In the chaos, chairs toppled. Doreen fired once, the shot grazing Roy's arm. Elijah tackled him to the ground. Miriam screamed, shielding Lucy as Roy struggled beneath her husband's fists. The rain outside became a roar. It didn't last long. Elijah stood, shaking, hands bloodied. Roy groaned on the floor, clutching his side. "Get out," Elijah growled. "You come back, you won't leave again." Roy crawled out, bleeding, disappearing into the rain. Miriam ran to Lucy, pulling her close. The girl didn't cry. She just looked up, her face pale but steady. "I knew he'd come," she whispered. Later, after the door was locked and the silence returned, Miriam sat at the table with Elijah. "We can't stay here," he said. "Not now. Not after this." Miriam looked at him. "You want to run?" "I want to keep you safe." "I want to be safe," she said. "But I also want to be seen. I want this girl to know she's more than something to hide. And I'm tired of pretending survival is enough." He said nothing. She stood. "I'm taking the ledger to Denver." Elijah stared. "That's suicide. It's justice." "She's just a girl, Miriam." "No," she said. "She's a human being. And so is Ruth." The choice was made. At dawn, Miriam packed a satchel with the ledger, letters, and the photograph of Ruth she'd found buried in Elijah's drawer. Lucy clung to her side. "I'm coming," the girl said. Miriam hesitated. "It'll be dangerous." "I don't care." Doreen offered to stay and keep the ranch alive while they were gone. Elijah didn't argue. Maybe because he knew better, or maybe because he'd finally realized Miriam was the one holding everything together, and if he stood in her way again, it might all collapse for good. They rode out under gray skies. Denver was 5 days' hard ride. The silence between Miriam and Lucy wasn't empty. It was full of resolve, pain, memory. At night, Miriam told her stories. Not fairy tales, real ones, about how the world didn't always make sense. How sometimes the people who should protect you were the ones who hurt you most. But also how surviving wasn't the end of the story. How sometimes, if you were brave enough, you could demand more. By the time they reached Denver, Lucy's hand didn't tremble when she took Miriam's. The office was nothing special, just a plain building off the main street. The Pinkerton man looked up as they entered, surprised. Miriam dropped the ledger on his desk without a word. His eyes widened as he flipped through the pages. This is everything," he whispered. "Yes," Miriam said. "It is." He looked at Lucy, then back at Miriam. You sure about this? Once it's out, there's no going back. There's nothing left to go back to, Miriam replied. Just forward. That night, in a quiet room above a bakery, Miriam lay awake beside Lucy, listening to the girl's soft breaths. She thought of Ruth, of Elijah, of Doreen, of everything they had lost and everything still left to fight for. She didn't know what would come next, lawsuits, threats, maybe worse. But she knew one thing for sure. She hadn't come west to be saved. She had come to save herself. And maybe, just maybe, to save one girl from becoming another forgotten name buried in dirt. That was worth everything. By spring, the valley had begun to bloom again. The snows melted into the rivers, wildflowers pushing their way through the frostbitten soil like soft declarations of life refusing to yield. Birds returned. So did the wind, gentler now, as though the land itself had exhaled a long breath it had held through the storm. Miriam stood on the back porch of the ranch house, her apron dusted with flour. She wasn't waiting for anything in particular. Not a letter, not a knock, not the return of something lost. Just standing, letting the warmth of the sun touch her, finally, without flinching. Behind her, the smell of bread drifted from the oven. In the barn, Lucy's laughter rose, clear, sudden, startlingly light. Elijah was helping her teach a colt to take the bit. Miriam smiled without meaning to. It still felt fragile, but it came easier these days. The fallout from the ledger had spread like spilled ink. Denver had taken notice. So had Washington. Names had been named. Trials scheduled. Several men had resigned before indictments could be filed. One had vanished entirely. Some said he'd fled to Mexico. Others said the guilt had taken him to the river with a pair of stones in his pockets. Miriam didn't ask. Some stories didn't need endings to be understood. Roy Thatcher had gone into hiding. He'd been spotted in Cheyenne, then in the Dakota Territory. He didn't return to the ranch. Didn't write. Didn't fight back. Miriam sometimes wondered if he'd expected her to back down. If he'd thought shame would keep her quiet. She hadn't seen shame in months. The papers tried to tell their version. Mail-order bride exposes corruption. That was the headline. They got the facts mostly right, except the part where they made her sound like some plucky heroine who knew what she was doing all along. She hadn't. She'd made choices. Some right, some desperate. And now, she was living with them. Elijah had changed. Slowly. Not into someone new, but into someone more honest. He didn't try to explain away the past anymore. He didn't offer excuses. He didn't ask forgiveness, but he showed it. Through work, through patience, through the quiet way he treated Lucy like someone worthy of attention. He still didn't sleep much, but he didn't drink either. Some nights, they sat on the porch and said nothing for an hour. Just listened to the wind, to the crickets, to the low hum of a world still moving even after it had fallen apart. Lucy had taken to reading aloud at night. Miriam had found her old primer tucked away in a trunk and handed it over without ceremony. The girl lit up at the sight of it, like someone seeing proof they might belong after all. And one night, without asking, Lucy called her Ma. Just once. Soft, like testing the shape of the word. Miriam had gone to bed with tears soaking her pillow. In May, Doreen packed her bags and said she was headed south. El Paso, she said. Maybe Tucson. Always wanted to see the desert. Miriam tried to hide her sadness. Doreen noticed. You don't need me anymore, she said. You've got what you came for. And she's got you. She hugged Lucy hard, then whispered something in her ear that Miriam didn't hear. But whatever it was, Lucy nodded solemnly, and Miriam didn't ask. You'll come back? Miriam said. Maybe. Doreen replied, then winked. If you promise not to feed me that terrible bread you keep baking. Miriam laughed. It felt real. That summer, the ranch began to heal. Elijah bought 2 new horses. Miriam planted a small herb garden. Lucy caught a garter snake and declared herself queen of the creek. And for once, no one corrected her. But not everything was peace. There were threats, low, anonymous ones. A letter here, a rock through the barn window there. Reminders that even when justice came, it didn't always arrive clean. Sometimes it dragged mud behind it. Sometimes it came with enemies who wore clean collars and smiled in courtrooms. But Miriam didn't scare easy anymore. She kept the ledger in a tin box buried beneath the barn, just in case. Not out of fear, out of certainty. She knew how people behaved when power was threatened. In August, the Pinkerton man came by again. This time he brought news. They're going to offer pardons to some of the lower men, he said. It's not perfect, but it'll break the chain. Miriam didn't answer right away. She was shelling peas. "And Roy?" she finally asked. The man looked down. Still gone, but not forgotten. She nodded. "He'll turn up. They always do." He stood awkwardly. "You could move east. You'd be safer." Miriam chuckled softly. "I didn't come west to be safe." "No," the man said, studying her. "You didn't." He left after that. Weeks passed. One afternoon, Miriam took Lucy into town to pick up sugar and thread. On the walk back, they passed the old church, half burned and never repaired. Lucy stopped. "Why do they leave it like that?" she asked. "Maybe to remember what it cost," Miriam said. "Maybe because they're scared to rebuild it wrong." Lucy stared at it. "If we fixed it, could we go inside?" Miriam blinked. "You want to?" Lucy nodded. "I think Ruth would like that." So Miriam spoke to the town council. They shrugged. "Do what you want," one of them said. "Just don't ask for money." Miriam didn't. That fall, she and Lucy and Elijah cleaned out the old pews. They cleared ash, painted the walls, hung a single lantern above the pulpit. It wasn't for sermons, it was just a place now. For stories. For memory. They named it Ruth's Hall. By winter, a few women came to sew there. A teacher offered to hold reading lessons on Wednesdays. Someone left a pie on the steps. No one talked much about the past, but they came, and that meant something. On the first day of snow, Lucy asked Miriam if she was still scared. "Of what?" Miriam asked. "That they'll come back. That we'll lose everything again." Miriam looked at her, brushing the girl's hair behind her ear. "Yes," she said, "but I'm not letting fear decide what kind of life we get to live." Lucy seemed to think about that a long time. Then she smiled. "I'm not scared either," she whispered. That night, Miriam went out to the barn alone. She dug up the tin box, held it in her lap for a long time. She could have burned it, could have thrown it in the river, but instead, she buried it again, not to hide it, but to mark that some truths didn't need to be carried every day to still matter. On the last page of the ledger, there was a scribbled note, not in Roy's handwriting. "The land always remembers." The question is, who gets to write the story? Miriam smiled faintly. She didn't know who wrote it. Maybe Elijah, maybe someone else. But she knew the answer. The ones who stayed. The ones who chose truth over silence. The ones who saw pain and still chose to keep going. Maybe the world didn't reward that kind of thing. But sometimes the reward was just this, a child's laughter. A loaf of bread rising in the oven. The sound of a hammer on old wood. And the knowledge that once a woman everyone had called too fat, too strange, too much to love, had told the truth and changed everything. Not perfectly, but enough.